for this circumstance and the CNN reporting to come out against Mark Robinson, who's the current lieutenant governor, who's one of Donald Trump's top surrogates in the state and is himself running for governor. He's the GOP nominee. We don't know how that's going to affect Donald Trump's campaign in the state, but we do know that as Trump comes to North Carolina tomorrow, and I'll be with him in Wilmington, as he campaigns, Mark Robinson will not be there, and that is going to be something different. He's been campaigning with Trump across North Carolina and in some other places, and so at least we can tell from the tea leaves in that these allegations against Mark Robinson is something that the Trump campaign is distancing itself from at some point for him not to be there on the trail tomorrow.
To the United States now and the state of South Carolina, where a man is due to be executed this hour, just days after the key witness for the prosecution in his case came forward to say he lied at trial and the state was putting an innocent man to death. 46-year-old Khalil Divine Blackson Allah, also known as Freddie Owens, was due to be killed by lethal injection at 11 o'clock our time, so 17 minutes ago, unless given clemency from South Carolina's governor. And in the last hour, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court denied Freddie Owens' request to halt his execution as scheduled. He'd asked the court to delay it while he waited for it to decide on whether he could file another appeal in the U.S. District Court. Well, let's speak to Meg Kinnard, a political reporter for the Associated Press, who joins me from Columbia, South Carolina on this. Meg, hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hey there, of course. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, I mean, Khalil Divine Blackson Allah, he's 46 years old. He must have thought at last when his former friend came forward. It's talking about a guy called Stephen Golden, who was also charged in the robbery and murder. And on Wednesday said he didn't do it. I was pressured. I gave his name instead of somebody else because I feared reprisals. He must have thought at last. And yet, no.
Yeah, we would imagine that that did give a bit of hope to Owens as he entered these last hours before this scheduled execution. And, we oftentimes see these last minute appeals and certainly the request for clemency come through, but to have a former co-defendant and someone who had testified in Owens' trial to come forward and say, you know what I said, that's just not true. That is a little bit different and not something that is super typical of these kinds of cases. But in considering that testimony and that affidavit, the authorities did not see what they considered to be something definitive because Golden didn't offer up an explanation of who else may have committed this crime or give any other suggestions as to what the circumstances could have been. And to the authorities considering it, it wasn't enough. And they decided that Owens' execution should go forward.
Right. I mean, one wonders what else then I suppose the defence can do, given that they must have thought this at least puts reasonable doubt into the mix and would give them a chance of another appeal.
Right. And again, when it comes down to the wire in these last minute sorts of situations, I mean, I'm no attorney, but I have covered legal affairs for a long time. And to hear these attorneys make these arguments, oftentimes in these sorts of cases, what we have seen that can overturn the decisions is DNA evidence, something scientific that disproves or proves the circumstances in question. We don't have that here. And so perhaps that's one of the things that the authorities were considering when they said, this just isn't enough. We can't really hold this execution up any longer.
But I understand there was no DNA evidence against Allah himself. He was 19 at the time. And let's remember the victim, Irene Graves, who was a cashier. She was in a convenience store in November 1997. She was a 41-year-old mother of three, shot in the head during the robbery. No forensic evidence connecting Allah to the shootings. There was surveillance footage showing two masked men with guns, but they were not identifiable. So they needed to get somebody. And this guy came forward, Stephen Golden, and testified. I mean, he was a co-defendant. And so that's why we're here.
Right. And in these cases, when there is that testimony of someone who was there and says, I saw what happened, that is strong. And juries take that into consideration, certainly when they're coming down with these sorts of decisions. Obviously, a death penalty case is one of the most serious and touchiest legal circumstances that we as a society deal with. And, I wasn't there. I didn't cover this case when it happened, but I would imagine that hearing that in-person first-person testimony from someone who was also there at the scene probably played a pretty large role in their minds. Now, for Stephen Golden to come forward years later and say, okay, that's not actually what I meant to say, it may be too little too late, whether it's true or not what he's saying now. The fact that he testified under oath some years ago as to how we got here with Owens being convicted in this case, that certainly was something that the jurors at the time took very seriously.
Yeah, I'm sure you and others are watching very closely to see if any further developments come out in this case, because the execution was meant to have taken place some 20 minutes ago. Meanwhile, across the state border in North Carolina, Meg, Kamala Harris's campaign, well, they're jumping on the apparent links between Donald Trump's, do we call him a friend, Mark Robinson, a supporter, and really odious, appalling views on Nazism, calling himself a black Nazi. Now, this is following a bombshell report from CNN.
Right. And let's not forget, here in the United States in this presidential election in November, North Carolina is one of those most pivotal places where we expect the margins to be closest. And it really could be playing a major role in who wins on November 5th or whenever the election's actually decided. But for this circumstance and the CNN reporting to come out against Mark Robinson, who's the current lieutenant governor, who's one of Donald Trump's top surrogates in the state and is himself running for governor, he's the GOP nominee. We don't know how that's going to affect Donald Trump's campaign in the state, but we do know that as Trump comes to North Carolina tomorrow, and I'll be with him in Wilmington, as he campaigns, Mark Robinson will not be there, and that is going to be something different. He's been campaigning with Trump across North Carolina and in some other places, and so at least we can tell from the tea leaves in that these allegations against Mark Robinson is something that the Trump campaign is distancing itself from at some point for him not to be there on the trail tomorrow.
Yeah, it was a CNN investigation. It says here, I'm just reading directly, despite a recent history of anti-transgender rhetoric, Robinson said that he enjoyed watching transgender pornography, a review of archived messages found in which he also referred to himself as a perv. Well, if that can't tank your campaign, I don't know what can. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us, Meg Kinnard, political reporter for the Associated Press, joining us from Columbia, South Carolina.